Noam Chomsky is a world-renowned political activist, writer, and professor of linguistics at MIT. The New York Times Book Review said of him, judged in terms of the power, range, novelty, and influence of his thought, Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive. To which he adds,
yeah, nobody ever quotes the next sentence. How can he write such terrible things about U.S. foreign policy or something like that? Yeah.
That addition kind of made your day, didn't it?
Oh yeah, that made me feel I wasn't doing something wrong.
Tell me a little bit about your background. You grew up in Philadelphia. Your parents were Hebrew teachers, I believe.
Mm-hmm. It was basically first-generation immigrant family. They were very much immersed in the local Jewish community, Hebrew education. This is the 1930s, so it's early Zionism, pre-state Zionism. That was the milieu. My own life was, soon became my own life, but that was the background that I came out of.
And you went to camp, as I recall?
Later on, when I was a young teenager, 11, 12, we went to Hebrew-speaking camps. And then I, first as a camper, then later as a counselor, helped.
You were proficient in Hebrew very early?
Reasonably. Proficient. It's a matter of measuring, but yes, I could get by. And I read very easily. Had read a lot of, I grew up immersed in Hebrew literature and the Bible and so on. In Hebrew, that is. Yeah.
You got part of, I guess, your political education on a street corner in New York.
In a sense, yeah. I had an uncle who, this is again the 1930s and early 40s, so the whole family was mostly unemployed seamstresses, working people, and so on. But there were few who had jobs, and one uncle had a severe disability, and he was able to get a newsstand under one of the New Deal type programs that were around in those days. So the newsstand was the place which supported half the family. But he was also he himself had never gone through school, but he was very well educated, more so than almost anybody I've met. And the newsstand became a center for a lot of emigre intellectuals from Europe who would hang around there in the evenings and have fascinating discussions. And it was a lot of fun to just be serving newspapers and listening.
So you would, jump on the train from Philadelphia?
As soon as I was old enough to take the train by myself at 12 or so, I'd head off to New York as soon as I had a chance, stay with my relatives, who were a very lively bunch, Jewish working class, left, all involved in intellectual culture, so a mixture of strange Marxist groups and the Budapest String Quartet and so on and so forth. And although very few of them had had anything in the way of formal education, except very elementary, but didn't matter. And then I'd spend my time wandering up and down something that's long since disappeared, but Fourth Avenue below Union Square used to be full of little secondhand bookstores. Again, a lot of European exiles would have their own particular slant, Spanish anarchism or some other thing. And that was fascinating too. They're very eager to talk to some young person coming in. It wasn't that usual, so got special treatment. And picked up a lot of literature too. In fact, when I started writing about these things years later, I used a lot of primary documentation that I'd picked up around that time, which wasn't available elsewhere.
What kind of stuff do they talk about at the newsstand?
There was a lot of, many of the emigres happened to be psychiatrists, like German Jewish psychiatrists. So there was a lot of Freud, Steckel, that sort of thing, and then every variety of left-wing politics you can think of. These were very lively days, and political discussion was common and just part of everybody's life.
And how did you discover linguistics as your field?
Through politics, actually. This is back in Philadelphia. I met Zelig Harris. I was about, I guess, 16 or 17 and pretty bored with college. I was thinking of dropping out. But I happened to meet him through political contacts. He himself was a very influential figure among young intellectuals, mostly Jewish, but not completely. Much more so than is known, because he didn't write much. But many people passed through his influence, many of them well known. And I was one of the younger ones. And his interests were sort of independent left, sort of anti-Bolshevik left, and what was then called Zionism, now it would be called anti-Zionism, commitment to a future binational Jewish, Arab, working class-based community in what was then Palestine, which was part of the Zionist movement at the time. Now it would be considered different, and I was already interested in that, so meeting him was exciting and became an influence. I later discovered he was a professor of linguistics at Penn, and in fact, one of the leading figures in the world. And got drawn into his courses and back into college, in fact.
You have come to change your views about Israel, Israeli politics over the years.
Not that much. I still believe pretty much what of course it's different now than when I was 12 years old, but basically the same point of view. I mean, the circumstances have changed, but my own position hasn't changed very much.
What is your position, and how have the circumstances changed?
Well, remember, that was pre-state.
Right.
So, of course, everything changed when the state was established. Although I maintained my involvement and interest. In fact, came pretty close to living there. My wife and I spent some time on a kibbutz. We might have gone back. It was a question. But I was opposed to the establishment of a Jewish state, which, again, was part of the Zionist movement at the time. Not a huge part, but there was an element of it that thought a Jewish state is a bad mistake. I thought so then. I still think so.
A Jewish state as opposed to
a democratic state. The two are inconsistent. I mean, people can try whatever manipulation they like, but if the United States were a Christian state in anything but symbolism, it wouldn't be a democratic state. I mean, taking Sunday off is okay, but if there's real discriminatory legislation and practice that distinguished Christians from non-Christians or whites from non-whites, to that extent it would be a flawed democracy, almost by definition. And that's intrinsic in the form of the Jewish state that was established. I mean, the High Court in Israel actually declared it to be the state of the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora. So my state, but not the state of a Palestinian Arab citizen of Israel. And this shows itself in all kinds of ways. But it became much more, all of these problems became far more exacerbated after 1967, when the military occupation began. It's now in its 36th year. And then all sorts of things happened. I mean, in 1971, Israel really had to make what turned out to be a fateful decision. They received an offer from Egypt through the UN mediator Gunnar Yaring to have Egypt offered a full peace treaty if Israel would withdraw just from Egyptian territory, nothing about the Palestinians, no West Bank. It was discussed internally in Israel in the now we know it from released cabinet records, but then in the Hebrew press. They knew that it was a possibility of peace and integration into the region. The choice was that or expansion, which means permanent confrontation, dependence, crucial dependence on the United States. And they chose the latter course. And a lot of things have followed from that, which are, in my view, very harmful to the society and extremely dangerous, and leading to a constant threat of very serious war, plus 35 years of persecution of an oppressed population. That has changed things enormously.
Do you see any end to that?
Yeah, a very simple end. In fact, everyone in the world knows what it is and has known for years. The end is a diplomatic it gets more remote the longer you delay it, but the end has been, since the 1970s, a political settlement on the internationally recognized border, that pre-war border, pre-June '67, with mutual and minor territorial adjustments and other arrangements about other matters. The crucial matter is territorial. That's been the international consensus since the mid-1970s. The U.S. has unilaterally blocked it and still does. And as long as that continues, there won't be a political settlement.
What about Jerusalem?
Jerusalem, you can finesse one way or another. I mean, theoretically, it's supposed to, under the original UN resolutions, it's supposed to be an internationalized city. Okay, that's not going to happen. But Jewish and Arab neighborhoods could be mostly Jewish, mostly Arab neighborhoods could be separated. Two capitals could be set up side by side. But the Palestinian one would have to have access to the Palestinian state. That's the crucial issue. And many people have pointed out, I think correctly, that Jerusalem is a problem you could probably settle in 15 minutes. The main problems are the territorial boundaries.
As we speak, the White House has announced that it will declare an end to the war in Iraq tomorrow. In your opinion, what was that war all about?
Well, we can be certain about one thing. The White House made it very clear that nothing it said could be taken seriously. So we know that the reasons they gave can't be the reasons. The way we know that is because they are contradicted every day. I mean, one day, the single question, as they put it, is Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. If they get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, it's all over. The next day, it turned out that it didn't make any difference what they did about their weapons. We had to impose our own regime, what's called regime change.
Yeah.
And the third day, it was some other story. So we can put aside the official explanations. They made it clear to us that they're not to be taken seriously. So then we have to speculate, what was it about? And I think it's some pretty clear, plausible explanations. I mean, first of all, there's a background issue, which doesn't account for the timing of the war, but is always in the background. And that is that Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's always been clear that one way or another, the U.S. would regain control over them or seek to do so. It does dominate the U.S. does dominate the Gulf energy producing region, which is by far the largest and richest in the world and will be for another couple of generations. That's been policy since the Second World War. Iraq was kind of an anomaly in that it broke out of it, and there would be an effort to get it back in, that was certain. What about the timing? Well, the timing is kind of striking. If you look at the propaganda about invasion of Iraq, it really begins last September. I mean, it was sort of simmering in the background, but in September, that's when Condoleezza Rice told us about the mushroom cloud and the massive government propaganda disseminated uncritically by the media was produced about Iraq being a threat to our survival and intimations that Iraq was behind the September 11th attacks and was planning new ones. And that showed up very quickly in the polls. By the end of September, a majority of the population actually believed that Iraq was a serious threat to U.S. security. And over the months, the number of people who believed that Iraq was involved in the September 11th attacks has reached something like 50% probably. There's nobody in the world who believes anything like this, including the CIA. But it did come to be public opinion. And those opinions are very strongly correlated with support for the war, not surprisingly. Why September? Well, a couple other things happened in September. One thing that happened was it was the opening of the midterm election campaign. And as Karl Rove, campaign manager, had already informed Republican activists, they cannot go into the campaign with social and economic issues being prominent, or they'll get smashed. There have to be security issues, which will lead people to, they hope correctly, to suppress their concerns about jobs, pensions, Enron, and so on, in favor of safety, which will flock to power. And it worked, barely. Rove has already said they're going to have to do the same for the presidential campaign. And in fact, that ran right through the 80s when the same people were running Washington, pushing the panic button every year over something or other. The other thing that happened, which I think is even more significant, is that they announced the national security strategy in September, which calls for, it sent plenty of shudders around the world, including the U.S. foreign policy elite. This was a substantial change in official policy. I mean, there are precedents, but it's never been official policy before. It was a policy of openly announced intention to rule the world by force and to prevent any potential challenge to that domination. It's called preemptive war, but it's not preemptive, it's preventive, and even that's an exaggeration. We'll just attack anyone who's in the way. Well, when you announce a doctrine, you have to illustrate it. Otherwise, nobody takes it seriously. To illustrate the doctrine of preventive war, you have to pick the appropriate target. First of all, it has to be weak and defenseless. There's no point attacking anybody who can fight back. That's ridiculous. So it has to be weak and defenseless. On the other hand, it can't be, say, Burundi, because that's worthless. Nobody who wants it. It has to be weak, defenseless, and important. Okay, that spells Iraq. And that was a perfect Petri dish, as the New York Times called it, test case to illustrate the new norm of preventive war, to get the world to understand we mean it. And I think those factors probably account for the timing. In the background is the long-term interest. But as I say, you can't, these have to be speculations because there's no official information that means anything. It's all self-contradictory.
What do you expect will follow in Iraq? Do you expect democracy to blossom there?
A special kind of democracy. We have 100 years of experience in our backyard to go by. The U.S. has dominated Central America and the Caribbean for a century. It's had plenty of influence in other places, and it has tolerated, even fostered democracy, but on a condition. The democratic decision has to conform to U.S. policy. If a country's democratic choices go in opposition to U.S. policy, the government's overthrown, either by coup or invasion or economic strangulation or something or other. And in fact, this is extremely explicit in policy formation. It takes discipline not to see it. So for example, in the case of Cuba, the U.S. International terrorist attack on Cuba, and that's what it is, began within months after Castro's takeover. It was very sharply escalated by the Kennedy administration. We now have the internal documents that describe what they had in mind, and it's the same as everywhere else, Guatemala, Iran, everywhere. What they state is that the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. Policies are that the region has to be subordinated to U.S. power. And this is successful defiance of that. Doesn't matter what they do, they've got to conform. The wars in Central America in the 1980s were to impose a form of democracy which would be, quote, a leading specialist, top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites who have been associated with the United States retain power. I'm quoting Thomas Carothers, who's a leading historian, but also writes from the inside. He was part of Reagan's so-called democracy enhancement programs in the State Department. And that's a correct characterization, and that's what will happen in Iraq. I mean, if the majority of the population happens to be Shiite, suppose they call for an Islamic state linked to Iran. The United States will never tolerate that. In fact, it's already said so. You can have a democracy as long as you do what we say.
You have felt that politics are driven by the economic interests of what you call the privileged elite. Can you tell me about that and who these people are?
First of all, that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of 100% of people who work on foreign affairs. I mean,
it's an opinion with which you agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a truism. It's true of every country, not just the United States. I mean, there's an internal distribution of power in every country. You know, it's not that everybody is equal. And the internal distribution of power reflects itself in decision-making in the state system in different ways. I mean, if a country has a powerful union movement, for example, there'll be a labor contribution to policy. The United States doesn't have that. We have basically business parties. And there's a concentrated sector of economic power, kind of a corporate sector, linked closely to government. And they tend to set the basic framework for policy choices. I mean, it's not mechanical. You can't deduce that this or that policy is going to come out. But it's a very powerful framework from which there's very little deviation. Actually, the media don't even tolerate any discussion of anything beyond it, except very much at the margins. Even if the population happens to, I mean, there are many striking cases where the population is pretty strongly opposed to policy. But if there's a split between elite opinion and popular opinion, these issues just don't even show up in elections. I mean, international economic arrangements are a striking example. The population's almost, but by substantial majorities, opposed to most of the arrangements. There's near elite consensus. As a result, they just don't show up, except very marginally in political debate and political campaigns and other things. Actually, what I said about the Middle East is another example. Roughly, I think, about 2/3 of the population it supports the general international consensus that I mentioned, but U.S. elite opinion does not. As a result, the issue just doesn't come up.
The writer Tom Wolfe calls this the old cabal theory and implies that it's kind of nutty, I guess. Does that sort of criticism?
Yeah, if you think it's nutty for people with wealth and power to use their influence, it's about as nutty as the fact that the sun rises every morning.
A couple of your statements I will quote now. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor saved tens of millions of lives. How did that happen?
It's not support of it. It's just saying you cannot evaluate an action by looking at the range of consequences. Actually, probably in India alone, it saved tens of millions of lives.
How so?
Kicking the British out. One of the results of wasn't the intention of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but if you look at the events that unfolded, one of the things that happened is that the Europeans mostly left Asia, not easily, but so the French fought a brutal war, the Dutch fought a war, but they finally left. And the effect of that in Asia was dramatic. I mean, if you look at the demographic patterns in, say, India, there haven't been any major famines since the British left. There were terrible famines before. In fact, India, it barely developed during the British period, hundreds of years. It had been one of the commercial and industrial centers of the world when the British took it over. The British turned it into an impoverished agricultural society with a wealthy elite and some infrastructure, based on their dominance. But it was a miserable situation. People like Nehru, who was an Anglophile, described the British as like the Nazis. After independence, it's not a wonderful place by any means, but at least the massive famine stopped. and some development picked up. And it's much the same throughout Asia. So an indirect consequence of the Japanese aggression and violence happened to be the liberation of a good deal of Asia. That's incidentally why plenty of Asian nationalists supported the Japanese. For example, Sukarno in Indonesia supported the Japanese all the way through. It was anti-fascist, but supported the Japanese because they were going to kick the Dutch out. And it's the same throughout. So, actions have all kinds of consequences. But you cannot justify Japanese atrocities and aggression on the basis of the fact that inadvertent consequences happened to lead to the liberation of Asia. That was the context in which that comment was made. And it's, I don't think there's any doubt of the historical accuracy of the comment.
The U.S. bombing in Afghanistan was silent genocide.
No, what I said is that that the assumptions they were making were that could well be a consequence. Remember, the bombing of Afghanistan was taken on the assumption that it might well put millions of people at risk of starvation. That assumption was very widespread. You can read it in Harvard's major international journal, International Security. The New York Times, for example, estimated after a month that the number of people at risk of starvation had risen by 50%, from 5 million to 7.5 million. And in fact, right after September 11th, even before the bombing, the U.S. Ordered Pakistan to terminate food supplies that were keeping a good part of the population at the edge of survival. So that policy, under the assumptions in which the policy was being conducted, could well have led to silent genocide. That's one of the reasons why rational people should oppose policies like that.
You said that if the Nuremberg principles were applied, every post-World War II president would be indictable.
It's probably true.
Can we run down them real fast? What did Eisenhower do that you would indict him for?
Eisenhower overthrew the conservative nationalist government of Iran with a military coup. He overthrew the first and last democratic government in Guatemala by military coup and invasion, leading to years of, in Iran it led to 25 years of brutal dictatorship, finally overthrown in '79. In Guatemala it led to massive atrocities which are still continuing. That's after almost 50 years. In Indonesia, this wasn't known until recently, but he conducted the major clandestine terror operation of the post-war period up until Cuba and Nicaragua in an effort to break up Indonesia, strip off the outer islands where most of the resources are, and undermine what was then considered as a threat of Indonesian democracy. Indonesia was too free and open. It was allowing a political party of the poor to participate, and they were gaining a lot of ground, so that Eisenhower supported and helped instigate a military rebellion in the outer islands. This is just for starters. These are all indictable offenses.
What about Kennedy?
Kennedy was one of the worst. Kennedy, first of all, invaded South Vietnam. During the Eisenhower administration, they had blocked a political settlement in 1954 and instituted a kind of a Latin American style terror state, which had killed maybe 60 or 70,000 people by the end of the Eisenhower period, and had instigated a response, a reaction. Kennedy recognized that it couldn't be controlled internally, so he simply invaded. In 1962, about a third of the bombing missions that were carried out by the U.S. Air Force in U.S. planes with South Vietnamese insignia, but U.S. pilot. He authorized napalm. He began the use of chemical weapons to destroy food crops. They began programs which drove millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps. Now, that's aggression. In the case of Cuba, it was just a massive campaign of international terrorism, which almost led to the destruction of the world, led to the missile crisis. And we can continue. Again, these are all indictable offenses.
About Johnson?
Well, Johnson expanded the war in Indochina to the point where ended up probably leaving 3 or 4 million people dead. He invaded the Dominican Republic to block what looked like a potential democratic revolution there, supported the Israeli occupation in its early stages. Again, we can go around the world. Take, say, Carter. You know,
I'll get there, but Nixon's next.
Nixon, we don't even have to talk about. We can skip that one, okay? But
Ford, then Ford.
Well, Ford was only there for a short time, but long enough to endorse the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which became about as close to genocide as anything in the modern period. They pretended to oppose it, but secretly supported, in fact, not so secretly. The U.S., immediately after the invasion, the U.S. did join the rest of the world in formally condemning it at the Security Council. But Ambassador Moynihan was kind enough to explain to us, in his words, that his instructions were to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in any actions it might take to counter the Indonesian invasion. And he says proudly that he did this with considerable success. His next sentence says, in the next few months, it seems that about 60,000 people were killed. And then he goes off to the next topic. That's the first few months, went on to probably hundreds of thousands. Formally, the U.S. announced a boycott of weapons, but secretly it increased the supply of weapons, including counterinsurgency equipment, so that the Indonesians could consummate the invasion. That's just a short period in office, but that's indictable. Seriously, in fact, that's a major war crime.
Carter?
Carter increased, as the Indonesian atrocities were increasing. They peaked in 1978. Carter's flow of weapons to Indonesia increased. When Congress imposed human rights restrictions, by then there was a human rights movement in Congress, to block the flow of advanced weaponry to Indonesia, Carter arranged through Mondale, vice president, to get Israel to send U.S. Skyhawks to Indonesia to enable Indonesia to complete what turned out to be near genocide, killing maybe a quarter of the population or something. In the Middle East, Carter just won the Nobel Prize. His great achievement was the Camp David agreements. The Camp David agreements are presented as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In fact, they were a diplomatic catastrophe. At Camp David, the United States and Israel accepted, finally, Egypt's 1971 offer, which they had then, U.S. had rejected at the time, except that now it was worse from the U.S.-Israeli point of view because it included the Palestinians. In order to get Israel to accept Egypt's 1971 offer, after a major war and atrocities and so on, Carter raised aid, military and other aid to Israel, to more than 50% of total aid worldwide. Israel used it at once in exactly the way they said they were going to do, and as every sane person knew, as an opportunity to attack their northern neighbor, first in 1978, then in 1982, and to increase integration of the occupied territories. And that's for starters. We can continue.
Reagan?
I don't think we have to talk about that one either. I mean, Reagan is the first president to have been condemned by the International Court of Justice for what they called the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism in the war against Nicaragua. Again, that's just for starters. They also, the Security Council endorsed it in 2 resolutions, both of which were vetoed by the United States.
Bush won.
Well, we can begin with the invasion of Panama. The invasion of Panama, which according to the Panamanians killed about 3,000 people, since it's never investigated. We don't know if that's true or not. This was done in order to kidnap a disobedient thug who had been supported by the United States right through his worst atrocities. Noriega. He was brought to Florida and tried for crimes that he committed mostly on the CIA payroll. Okay, that's aggression. We could go into the details of the war in Iraq, but there were plainly opportunities for, they might not have worked, we don't know, but there were opportunities for diplomatic settlement, which the Bush administration refused to consider. And incidentally, the press would not report, with a single exception, and Long Island Newsday, which did report the whole story throughout accurately, and is the only newspaper in the country to have done so. The Bush administration then did attack, and the attack was carried out in a manner which is criminal under the laws of war. They attacked infrastructure. I mean, if you attack New York City and you destroy the electrical system, the power system, the sewage systems, and so on, that amounts to biological warfare, and that's the nature of the attack. Then came a sanctions regime, which it's mostly Clinton, but began with Bush, which is, by conservative estimates, killed hundreds of thousands of people while strengthening Saddam Hussein. That takes us off to Clinton, which that's the beginning, but that's by no means the end. We can run through it. Well, we can run through that one case suffices.
All right.
But there are plenty of others.
Bush too?
Well, let's go on with Clinton.
Okay.
I mean, one of Clinton's minor escapades, very minor, was sending a couple of cruise missiles to the Sudan to destroy what they knew to be a pharmaceutical plant. There was no intelligence failure. According to the only estimates we have from the German ambassador and the regional director of Near East Foundation, who does field work in Sudan, both of them estimate several tens of thousands of deaths from one cruise missile attack. It's pretty serious. If somebody did that to us, we'd regard it as bad news. And again, we can continue. In the Middle East, for example, Clinton began by declaring past UN resolutions, in the words of his administration, obsolete and anachronistic. Okay, so we're finished with that. No more international law. Then comes a period called a peace process, except that during the peace process, Israeli settlement, which means settlement paid for by the U.S. taxpayer and supported by U.S. military aid and diplomacy, continually increased. The most extreme year was Clinton's last year, the highest level of settlement, the highest since 1992. Meanwhile, the territories were cantonized, broken up into small regions with infrastructure projects and new settlement. I don't know what you call that, but it's under military occupation. And if anyone else was doing it, we'd call it a war crime. And again, we can continue. Bush too, I don't think we have to discuss.
Your call.
Okay.
How does, well, I want to get back to one thing you said. Newsday apparently got off the reservation somehow. What happened there, do you think?
I have no idea, but particularly one reporter, Newt Royce, kept reporting everything that was happening. I have a guess. I mean, what was going on was that he was reporting leaks from the government. The U.S. State Department was leaking reports from August 90, right up through December, the planning for the war, leaking reports saying that Iraq was making offers that the State Department regarded as serious and negotiable, maybe not acceptable, but negotiable. Now, no one in the State Department leaks reports to a suburban newspaper. What I assume was happening was that they were leaking them to the New York Times, which was refusing to print them. And then they leaked them to Newsday, which appears on every newsstand in New York City with a big full front page headline saying, Iraq offers this and that. I mean, Can you think of any other explanation? If you were in the State Department, would you leak documents to Newsday?
But it's a part of an immense corporation, Newsday,
Yeah.
a Times Mirror
News,
corporation.
right? And somehow that newspaper alone, and this one reporter, in fact, who I don't know, but he was doing a very good job, kept reporting it. But, and what typically happened is that Newsday would report it, big front page story, and a couple of days later in the Times, in the sort of back pages, you'd see a phrase saying, well, reports claim that Iraq made an offer, but the White House denies it or something. So very few people in the country knew about this.
We've got a few minutes left before we're going to open this for questions from the people here in the studio. You've said either the general population will take control of our destiny or there will be no destiny for anyone to control. Why is that so?
I think we are in a situation where, I mean, the human species has developed the capacity to destroy itself and everything else. Now, that's been true since the Second World War. And we are edging very close to the possibility of that happening. It's come very close in the past. I mean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Arthur Schlesinger described as the most dangerous moment in human history, we just learned last October how dangerous it was. Last October, it was revealed at the retrospective conference of participants in Havana, American, Russian, and Cuban, that the world was literally one word away from terminal nuclear war. Russian submarine commanders, turns out, had nuclear-tipped missiles, and they were under attack by American destroyers at the edge of Kennedy's quarantine zone. They assumed the nuclear war was going on. Two of the commanders ordered the missiles sent. That would have led to a devastating response, taking out Moscow, then comes New York, and then we're over. One commander countermanded it. That was a consequence of an international terrorist war aimed at regime change. Those notions are right in the headlines. And we're coming very close to that now. I mean, the preventive war doctrine last September is just instructing people in the world that you better develop weapons of mass destruction or a means of terrorism in order to deter the United States. Where's that going to lead? You know? Or take, in another domain, nobody really understands in any detail what's going on with the climate. That's a complicated issue. But there's a near consensus among scientists that we're playing with fire. You know, could be. It's kind of like Afghanistan. You're risking the possibility of very severe destruction if anything goes wrong. These are sort of nonlinear processes. I mean, a slight change could have a big effect. And you don't know what's going to happen. You know, maybe an ice age in Europe or some other thing. Well, you know, we're very near the edge in nuclear weapons development, in other weapons of mass destruction, in policies that are creating international chaos, in possibly destroying an environment in which decent survival is possible. None of this is predictable. It's just all too close for comfort, and things are tending in that direction. I mean, and it's not particularly new. I mean, take, say, the history of Europe. You know, for hundreds of years, Europe was the most savage place in the world. The main activity of Europeans was slaughtering each other, and meanwhile, on the side, conquering most of the world. In 1945, they called it off. Why? Well, very straightforward reason. It was understood by French and Germans and British that the next time they play the centuries-old game of slaughtering each other, it's going to be the end of the world, because they had developed means of destruction so enormous that you just can't do it anymore. So now Europe is a peaceful region. But unless that extends to the world, the same problems are going to arise.
What's the good news?
The good news is that there's lots of good news. Part of it is that as a result of the activism of the last 40 years, which has been extensive, the United States is a much more civilized country than it was in the past. And the same has happened all over good parts of the world. There's now extensive, there are all kinds of things that didn't even exist before. Women's rights, minority rights, an environmental movement, anti-nuclear movements, international solidarity movements, global justice movements. None of this existed 40, 45 years ago. Most of it is post-1960s. That started it off, but then it took off. It's changed, hasn't changed institutions, but it has changed consciousness and awareness. And it's true of a large part of the world. Actually, much of the initiative for these developments is coming from the South. There's a good reason why the World Social Forum meets in Brazil, not in Paris or New York. It's because that's where the leading edge of the activism is for significant social change throughout much of the South. The North has joined to an extent, and these are hopeful possibilities for popular movements reversing a course that's a very dangerous one.
On that note of optimism, we'll take questions now from people here in the audience.
I noticed that you mentioned that when U.S. government tries to pick up a target to attack, they usually pick up a weak, defenseless, and important target. So since the Iraqi issue has been announced to be officially end, and also it is also said that there are several possible targets that U.S. government might pick up. So one example might be in the North Korea, but it is recently it has been said that the U.S. Army stationed in North Korea have retreated to Japan.
South Korea.
Excuse me.
Is stationed in South Korea.
Oh, sorry, in
Yeah.
South Korea. Sorry, has retreated to Japan. But it seems that the war will break out. According to some people's belief. But it seems that North Korea is a country with almost no resources, but it's also quite defensive, and it is said that it has nuclear weapons. So I wonder whether you have any opinion on this issue and what kind of benefits will be brought to America if the war breaks out.
Well, first of all, the business about attacking defenseless enemies, I actually happen to be paraphrasing a leaked intelligence document from the Bush 1 administration. When they came into office, like every administration, they call for an intelligence survey of the world. Usually we don't find out about it for 30 or 40 years until it gets declassified. But in this case, someone leaked a paragraph from it, and it was published by Maureen Dowd in the New York Times. Her column is considered a kind of gossip column, so people don't read it very carefully. But she actually did publish in 1990 or so the paragraph that was leaked from that document. And what it said is that in the case of confrontation with much weaker enemies, which it's tacitly assumed are the only ones you're going to attack, in the case of confrontations with much weaker enemies, the United States must defeat them decisively and rapidly, because otherwise political support will erode. It's not the 1960s when Kennedy could carry out a war for years and Johnson could escalate it with no protest. Now you got to build up the enemy to look like a massive force and then destroy him decisively and rapidly, and you got to pick a much weaker one. And that's a sensible, you may not like it, but it's a rational doctrine. And if you look at the wars of the 90s, that's what they are. The North Korea case is a complicated one. What the United States has been telling the world loud and clear for the last couple of months is that if you want to prevent us from attacking you, you'd better have a deterrent. Iraq had no deterrent, so therefore you can smash it. North Korea had a deterrent, not nuclear weapons, incidentally. Massed artillery. They have massed artillery aimed at Seoul and at the American forces there. And unless the Pentagon can figure out a way to take them out with precision-guided munitions before they're used, it could just be devastating. Actually, the predictions in the Clinton years from the Pentagon were that if the U.S. was to go to war, as one general put it, they better have 100,000 body bags ready. So North Korea has a deterrent, which is conventional. Nuclear weapons they may have a couple of years from now, but that's not the issue now. And that held off an attack. Well, why is North Korea important? You're completely right. It has no resources. It's one of the poorest, most horrifying countries in the world. But it's right in the middle of a crucial area. This whole region is a rapidly developing economic region. It has tremendous resources in Siberia, lots of gas and oil and other resources, has huge countries that are industrialized and need the resources, particularly Japan and South Korea, but now China too, which is now a resource importer. And there's a good reason to expect that that whole region is going to go off in its own independent direction. The United States does not want that. It wants that region to be subordinated to U.S. power, and North Korea happens to be right in the middle of it. If there's going to be pipelines from, Siberia to South Korea and off to Japan, that's where they're going to go. So it itself has no material significance, but its position in one of the most rapidly developing regions of the world definitely does.
I appreciate your emphasis is on hope or as activism as being a source of hope. And as a academic in training and a political organizer, in the last 2 years, I've experienced an inertia in the academic class, so to speak, that I've never experienced before, and I've been organizing for a number of years, including the first Gulf War. And so the first part of the question is, why do you think it is that at absolutely the most critical time, the mask has been removed in a lot of sense of this push, an expansion of empire, so to speak, that's the time that such extreme inertia has set in, and that people feel so impotent. And then the second part of the question is, how do you recommend breaking through that, particularly in academic class, because they have such resources? And I'm wondering if something like the French-based ATTACK organization may be somewhat of a model. And I just want to get your opinion on that.
Well, first of all, your age is significant. The academic world has never been rarely been a source of activism. It usually comes from somewhere else. There was a brief period in which it was true in the late 60s, not in the earlier period, when parts of the academic world, mostly students incidentally, very few faculty, did become actively engaged in elite universities and elsewhere. Then it kind of died down. In the 1980s, it happened to be an extremely activist period, but it was not coming from the academic world. It was coming more from churches in the Midwest and places like that. The Central America Solidarity movement was extremely significant. Didn't get a lot of attention because it was not coming from elite centers. But this is the first time in the history of imperialism, hundreds of years, that people from the imperial country actually went to live with the victims to try to help them and protect them. I mean, nobody in France went to live in Algeria during the Algerian War to live in an Algerian village, or ever. The Vietnam War was never even thought about, and the whole history of European and U.S. imperialism never happened. That happened on a very substantial scale in the 1980s. That's the reason why you now have volunteers in many parts of the world, including the Israeli-occupied territories. It's all an outgrowth of this. But the academic world was almost completely not involved. The same is true in the 1990s. It hasn't been the academic world. Like the global justice movements, which are the biggest ones. They didn't come out. I mean, there's students involved, a couple of faculty here and there, but it's mostly coming from elsewhere.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that, actually. I didn't mean to imply that the academics
No, I mean, we
were
happen to be in the
leading way,
academic
but
world, so rightly we should be concerned about what goes on there. You and I aren't going to organize steel workers, but we can do things where we live. So that's just the right question. What can change it is what's always done it in the past. People working hard to educate, to organize, to raise issues. I mean, we have tremendous privileges. In most parts of the world, if people try to do things like this, they face torture or assassination or something or other. We don't face anything. You know, we're completely free. We have a legacy of freedom that's unparalleled. We have enormous resources and privilege. We get every opportunity we can think of. What's lacking is will. One of the things that's common in a kind of a youth culture, student culture, like the academic world, is a very short attention span. You know, you figure things have to be done soon. And if they don't work in a week, you know, we quit. Like I went to a demonstration and nothing happened. Okay, now I'm going to quit. If you want anything to change, it means work over a long time, lots of defeats, occasional victories. You know, ultimately you get somewhere. You think of any popular movement that's ever done anything, you know, abolitionism, you know, women's rights, anything you think of, that's the way it works. Now, that was what was different in the working class culture that I grew up in as a kid. These came from movements that thought you're going to have to work hard for a long time to try to achieve something. And that's what happens. It's not going to be any quick victories. But there are plenty of opportunities, and you just have to keep at it. Attack, yeah. Well, Attack is an interesting group, and it's done important things. It's a fairly elite outfit. But it's one of the groups that was instrumental in setting up the World Social Forum. And they're pretty narrowly focused on a few crucial issues. One of their big issues is Tobin tax, you know, tax on financial interactions, which is probably a good idea. There's other possibilities like it. And it's been a very influential and important group, and it's starting in the United States, incidentally, so there are subgroups here. It's international, based in France. And it's the kind of thing that could be part of a serious U.S. Organizing effort, but only part, I think.
Yes, sir.
Given human rights violations by corporations, I was wondering how you make your purchasing decisions and if there are any products that you don't purchase.
Well, plenty of things I don't purchase, but not really for that reason. I mean, these are questions of tactics. I mean, do you affect human rights? Oh, let's take Coca-Cola, which is a big thing around here, I understand. Coca-Cola has just been, it's narrowly scraped by a district court case in Florida that was brought by the steelworkers in support of Colombian workers in a subsidiary of a Coca-Cola plant, which is one of the most vicious anti-union plants almost anywhere. And the particular case was a union activist who was murdered by paramilitaries in the plant. And the steelworkers who are pressing these human rights cases for Colombians, they can't do it themselves, are using provisions of American law, which do exist and have sometimes been applied. And they brought a case in Florida which got to the district court. And they sort of had a half victory. The district court severed Coca-Cola from the case, but kept the subsidiary. Well, you know, severing Coca-Cola was a technicality. So does that mean you should stop buying Coca-Cola? Well, if you stop buying Coca-Cola, is that going to help union activists in Colombia? That's the question you have to ask. These are, and you know, I don't think there's a simple answer. Like if you stop buying Coca-Cola, it's not going to have any effect. If there was a massive boycott of it, they'd notice it in the corporate headquarters and might do something. Like, for example, Nike and what's the other one, Reebok or something, the guys who make sneakers and things like that, have modified somewhat their horrendous human rights practices in plants in Asia as a result of pressure, most of it coming from students. And that had an effect. But these are questions you just have to answer in terms of their likely consequences for people who are suffering. There's no point in making gestures.
Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.
Okay.